All right, we are live and recording, and welcome to our panel. Our panelist is going to come right back on the screen, and Jody's here helping me. Those of you who are just rolling into the attendee room, if you don't mind, please put in the chat where you are joining us from, city and state if you'd like. And then if you have any, we did see some questions in the registrations, but if you have questions that you would like to add, I'll just do a little introduction, and then yeah, we'd like this to be as informative and helpful as possible, and that's all I have to say about that. So just a reminder to everybody. Oh yay, okay, so we've got Boston, we've got Dublin, yeah, look for, and San Diego, fantastic. And we have about, I think we have 9 or 10 people registered, but we also may have people on Facebook who will let us know where they're from. And Facebook actually has a lag, and it will, it gets a little confusing. So if you're watching on Facebook and you'd like to let us know where you're watching from, that would be great. I am super excited to introduce my friend Heather. And you know what? I never asked you, do you pronounce it Scholl or Skoll?
The first one, Scholl.
Scholl. Okay, awesome, awesome. All right, and so for everyone who doesn't know, Heather identifies as a white cis queer woman. She's an artist, an activist committed to creating experiences of truth that nurture a culture of self-examination and transformation. And in fact, Jody and I took one of her courses. In her work, she uses the personal lens of her own life to illuminate, I wish we could eliminate, to illuminate issues of race and whiteness, gender and sexuality, trauma and abuse. She primarily works with hand embroidery and has spent the last 5 years working on her series Whitework. Whitework examines white women's roles in the establishment and maintenance of white supremacy through whitework embroidery techniques. That's a mouthful, Heather. That's okay. I start to question, why do I do this on Fridays when I'm like the most tired? But I'm excited. So let's see. She is, Heather is a director of Confront White Womanhood, anti-racism workshops for white women, which again, Jody and I have actually attended one of those, and workshops that have been written about in Cosmopolitan and Slate. Her fine art has been shown in galleries and museums all over the country and has been written about on Huffington Post, Brooklyn Magazine, Bust. Now you wrote I-D. What is that? Is that a name of a magazine?
Yeah, ID magazine.
Okay, I've never heard of it. What's the focus of that magazine?
They've changed a bit, but they definitely started as kind of a design focused magazine, but sort of edgy counterculture design. But they've kind of expanded to a lot of different things now that they're mostly online, like most publications.
You have such a repertoire here. I'm like gonna go, okay, and Vice. So Heather is currently a fellow in the Leslie-Lohman Museum Artist Fellowship. She holds a BA in Race, Gender, and Sexuality and an MFA in Fashion and Knitwear Design. So we'll be discussing systemic racism, microaggressions, as well as hearing from Heather regarding her current work as an anti-racist helping confront white womanhood. And I'd like to actually introduce you now, give you the moment now to introduce yourself and say whatever else you would like to say, including, if you don't mind, telling people about your workshops that are coming up, because I think it's important as we talk about them at the beginning, then we can talk about them at the end as well, so that it kind of sticks and people know that this is a resource for them. So it's all yours. Microphone is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here and excited about what conversation is going to unfold. So I just want to start with saying that, acknowledging that I'm on Lenape land, and just want to take a moment to honor all the people past, present, and future from the Lenape people and the genocide that took place here and across the country. So
thank you for reminding me. I like to also recognize the Ohlone people for the land that I am on as well, and I totally skipped that, and I apologize to the Ohlone people. So thank you.
Yeah, it's important, and it's interesting because it's become even more important for me since moving. So I recently moved to Philadelphia from New York City, but I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and I have discovered that one of the lines of my family that I can trace back first came to America as colonizers and settled not too far from where I'm living right now in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
So they were part of one of those early waves of active displacement of Indigenous people. So
Yeah.
I feel like land acknowledgements have gotten a little weightier for me with that knowledge and history. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I accept the fact that I'm imperfect and I'm trying to improve, but that is definitely something that I want to remember to do. And so I think it would be better for me if I start to create an outline that I put that at the top every single time. So thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, outlines are really important. So I'm just trying to decide how I want to frame it. So I've been kind of moving more towards like a personal analysis. And I just want to say that, you know, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I come from a father who grew up in outside of Tacoma and with Quaker roots, and a mother who grew up in rural Arkansas with deep Southern conservative roots. So my history kind of spans those two areas of America and greatly informs me and my work and how I view the world. So that is kind of part of my orientation to this work. So my particular journey was I have been involved in learning about racism and showing up at protests and kind of being around racial justice movements for almost 20 years. I was a young teenager when I first started, and it was after Eric Garner's killer was not indicted that you know, I was in the streets a lot, and I had always wanted to do some sort of project around or do something more around racial justice than what I was doing. And it was that moment that it really clicked for me that all of my education and all of the work before, I was talking about somebody else's experience. And it was time that I needed to talk about my own experience and really reflect back on what my legacy was, where I was coming from, and what it actually meant to be a white woman in this world, and not try and claim that I could speak for somebody else, because I can't speak for anyone else's experience. So that was really where things shifted for me and how I approached it, and led to my personal evolution that brought me to starting Confront White Womanhood. So Confront White Womanhood hosts workshops and seminars that seek to illuminate the ways that white women contribute to white supremacy. So these tend to be ways that perhaps more subtle. So I've kind of broken it down into overt and covert violence, innocence and victimhood, universalism, and white saviorism. And kind of most of the things that we do fall into those categories. There's certainly outliers, but I particularly am focused around white saviorism, partially because of my Quaker roots and that aspect of my family. And then I've been really focused on the intersections of sexual violence and the history of racism and racial violence in this country, and the ways that that intersects with mass incarceration and the carceral state. So those are sort of my emphasis. And in the work, I really try to take us through both fact-based things, because I think it's really important to ground in like the real life events that happened that led to the situation that we're here in now, but also bring in the personal storytelling. Like, you know, those things happened and we were all living lives along that path, right? Like, so how does my personal experience, my mother's experience, relate to those historical facts as a way to kind of create a little bit more ownership of that, so it's not separate from us, but it's really enacted through us, and leading that towards accountability and how we show up in our lives, and how we can maybe shift how we're showing up in our lives. So that's overall.
Yeah, go ahead. And shift how we're showing up in other people's lives too.
Absolutely, right. Yeah, I mean, that was initially when we started the workshop, that was one of the phrases that I said was like, for white women to cause less harm in movement spaces. Like, you know, I was in activism circles, and oftentimes white women are some of the biggest barriers to really creating the changes that we want to have in the world. So how can, you know, this wave of white women that have been showing up in movement spaces for the last like 4 or 5 years, how can I support people in causing less harm in those environments?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, you've got quite a history and quite a resume. And I think that, I know that for me, I really enjoyed your workshop. And I am wondering, I want to take a minute for Jody, if you want to introduce yourself, because Jody does some work in alignment with what you've talked about. And Jody, do you want to say who you are?
Sure. I'm Jody Lewis, and I am the legal director for a nonprofit organization that provides services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So obviously there's that, like you, Heather, you were talking about that intersection between racism and sexual violence, and that how that plays a large role in the systemic issues that we see in the legal system, from whether it be law enforcement all the way up to actually what happens in court. I'm primarily in family court, and there's a lot of barriers that women face, and particularly women of color face within the family court system. Thank you.
And I'd love to note, I've asked Jody to be more of a participant with me as I do these webinars, because she's got great ideas. She's definitely, social justice is part of her platform in life. And so I just want to, just kind of open it up, that between the comments in the chat and on Facebook, that Jody and I will feed you things, Heather, as well. But we may each have questions that we can help direct the conversation in one form or another. So I am seeing that we have more attendees, and that's great. And we do have one woman who identifies as a Black female, unfortunately is recovering from surgery on her throat. And I'm so glad that you're here. I won't say your name in public, but just so grateful that all of you are here, and hope that we can answer any questions that you might have, or just, you may even want to put in the comments your purpose. Why did you choose to attend this webinar tonight? And I know some people, and this from Danville. Okay, so we've got Danville, Dublin, San Diego, that's right, and Boston. So if people want to say where they're from and what questions they have, and also maybe why you chose to come here tonight. So I think maybe, well, I don't know, let me see from Jody or from Heather, is there a burning desire? Is there one topic in particular that feels like it would be a great jumpstart for anybody?
I'll go. Heather, I think having listened to the workshop that Misha and I attended, and also I recently listened to a webinar that was focusing on particularly the death penalty and death sentences, death row, and racism, and how that plays a role. And a lot that came up was really that disparity between Black defendants with white victims, when we know that typically crimes are interracial, and that what they were seeing, that individuals on death row, primarily a very high percentage of Black defendants, it was a white victim, which really shows how there is such disparity in our criminal justice system because of that interracial analysis. But they also focused on, I'm getting to where I was going with this, that the role that sexual assault and rape played in making Blacks like villains in the process. And that happened way back. And I know you talked about that a lot in the workshop we attended regarding that connection with a white woman being raped, and it automatically being put on a Black individual and defendant, and how that really shaped to what has happened in our country with racism. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because I found that fascinating. Part of it, I know, is my background, but I think it's something that as a white woman, we really need to be aware about how that has played out with sexual violence and racism and our criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that I really argue is that the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction afterwards, that was when there's a huge flood of these accusations of Black men being a huge threat to white women's safety, and that they are going to rape any white woman they encounter. And there are lots of really dramatic and horrific stories of Black men being killed over these accusations. And I think that it's this period that defines rape for our culture as between white women and Black men. And so we don't really see sexual violence in other configurations, right? But we know that white men and even white women were sexually assaulting enslaved people as a form of violence and control. That was a form of white supremacy and the power system that existed. So that continues today as well, right? And like each way that we've kind of allowed this narrative to flourish and really enacted a lot of violence from it throughout history, has reinforced it, right? And even our movements towards sexual violence protections are typically led by white women and typically led by this idea of Black men being the greatest threat, and that the only solution is punishment and incarceration, that is the only way to deal with the problem. Yeah, I recently, there was just a mini series webinar of No Steps Back. So it was a New York-based conference for particularly people who work in sexual violence industries. But today was an interview with Beth Ritchie, and she wrote Arrested, oh, I forgot the second word. What is the name of that book? Sorry, that's Ritchie. The first word is Arrested. But she was part of it. She was a Black woman, and she was part of that movement that was trying to get some sort of sexual protection, sexual violence protections happening.
Arrested Justice.
Arrested Justice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And really spoke to that way that white women were simultaneously fighting for really a protection of themselves, and not really understanding an analysis of what sexual violence looks like for Black women and women of color, which that also looks like incarceration, that looks like assault from law enforcement, from guards, from other authority figures in our lives who we tend to assume are there to protect us, and are often the ones assaulting Black folks and people of color. So anyway, so that kind of like duality of what's actually happening has really changed how we see the world. And my efforts are really to kind of illuminate the ways that ideas of our safety and protection are illusions to support a culture of white supremacy, that they're not about our actual safety and well-being, right? When most of the time when these things are being said and like the white men or other folks are taking up arms to protect white women, they're not really concerned about intraracial assault. Like they're not concerned about family assaults or other assaults within our white communities. So it's not about our safety and well-being. And so if we want to prioritize that, then we need to reimagine what that can look like. That's my little rant.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So
yeah,
I
think Heather, just quickly to go off of that too, the webinar, and you just touched on it, I think it's a really important point. The webinar that I was on really talked about how Black victims aren't valued. You know, the white victim, the rape victim is like you were just talking about, right? It's not, everything hasn't been about safety, it's been about racism and perpetuating that. And at the same time, the system has also completely not heard about Black victims in the process as well. So the webinar was focusing on that, and I'm not going to get into it, but legal arguments that could be made regarding death row and how that plays a part in everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's also ways in which our response to trauma and assault is taken more seriously, right? So I don't want to speak too generally, but oftentimes white women are more likely to present as sad and weepy and that kind of like shrinking response to traumas. I know that was my response. That's how I've dealt with it. But that Black women and other women of color oftentimes have a different response. So sometimes there's anger, sometimes there's other emotional acting out that happens that is also, it's the same exact thing as shrinking and crying a lot and that sort of retreating, but we don't see that as a justifiable act of a victim. So there's a shift in how we treat victims just from that very beginning onset.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that can be an aspect of microaggressions, right? Is the ways in which we just don't, we judge certain emotional presentations differently depending on who they're coming from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that plays out in the court a lot.
Yeah.
So one of our attendees has put in the chat that they're actually running for town council and that they are not necessarily a politician, but an agent of change, an educator, and a business executive. And their platform is that they want to be the voice for those who have a voice but have not been heard. And so I'm really grateful that this person is here, because I want them also to be able to be the voice. And it's too bad that they're not able to be with us tonight, actually, because I would love to hear from her. And I'm wondering if you have some ideas or resources, Heather, of how Black women can be the voice for those who have not been heard. I know that I'm a white woman, and I've been offering this webinar. Actually, this is the first time I've had a white woman as my guest. Most of my panelists have been Black and brown, African-American, Canadian-American, Canadian African, excuse me, and European mixed race as my panelists to speak and just share, to have their voices to be heard. But I think in this sense, we're talking about on a political level, how can these women be heard? How can they have their voice? And if they can't have their voice, how they give it to another Black woman to have their voice. I don't know if that came across as articulately as I wanted it to, but.
Well, I would never tell a Black woman how to have a voice for other people, because I don't think that that's my place to do that.
Right, yeah. Like I said, I don't think it's very articulate what I was trying to say, but.
But, I think that it's always a concern when you have the opportunity for a platform, like how are you using it and what ways, and how are you staying connected to people most affected by the issues that you're talking about? How do you stay grounded in that? Because it's easy to detach from that. Once you get access to different spaces, it's easy to distance yourself from the people that you really intended to serve. So making sure that you stay attached to those folks and are listening and sharing that platform.
So let me extend that question then, because I think what I was trying to say is, as a white woman, and I actually haven't used the word white for so many, and when you fill out surveys, I decline to state, because I just feel like I'm all over the place when that comes to me. But as a Jewish white woman, how do I allow those voices to be heard?
So first, I'm just going to address the word allow, because that kind of replicates this top-down dynamic, right? That white people have the power where we can gift this space for other people. And
so hoping you would catch that. Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Which is tricky, right? Like that is kind of the language that we're steeped in, right? Is that how do white people allow space for other voices, but to really be conscious of shifting that language and shifting that perspective of it's not me allowing. Sometimes it's really just me stepping to the side, right? I just need to get out the way. And just being conscious of where you're taking up space so that you can get out of the way. And again, I think it's, staying really connected to those voices and who is being affected by issues. So, and amplifying those voices when you can, and knowing where, knowing your spheres of influence, I think is always really important. Like, what are your skill sets and what communities are you a part of? And using those to the highest advantage for everybody, right? And I think it's just really that shift of, I'm not doing this for somebody, but this is something that we are doing together, and this is how we build the culture and society that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what this person has said is their platform that they're initiating is called Brag Up, an acronym which means bringing racial awareness globally. And I love that.
Brag up.
Yep, yeah. But what I'm hearing you say, and I so appreciate that you snagged the word allow, because I'm constantly shifting my language. And, we could talk about microaggressions too, and the way we kind of use words and how it's societal. It's what we've grown up with. I'm not making an excuse at all. I'm trying to learn and grow. And, but I think it's that what I'm hearing you say is step aside, hand over the microphone, give the strength, give the space for the strength and power to come from those voices.
Yeah. Yeah. And then know where your voice belongs too, right? I mean, yeah, one of the things that I say as an educator is, learn from people of color, process with white people. And I can help with that processing. So there's that duality of like, where are you learning from, but also like, where are you expecting that labor, so that you're not like putting that expectation on folks of color. So that's just more applicable to my specific work, but yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat asking if perhaps Heather could comment on the incessant deaths, orange banner in the background.
My this back here.
They keep focusing on that.
So I'm an artist, and this is just a current series that I'm working on. It says, incessant deaths birth immortal spirits. So it's my project around trauma and recovery, and definitely mixing in a lot of different things, but yeah. I'm in my studio right now.
Yeah, and I just want to say, for those who are watching and listening, this is a very benevolent experience. Heather did not ask me to pay her to be here, and so I do want to make sure I emphasize, I can't emphasize enough actually, the value that Jody and I'll speak for myself, but got out of the workshop that we attended. And so those of you that are on the call want to look into Heather's workshops, I really highly encourage you to do so, and to please pass her name and information around, and we can put you, or Heather, you can put your website and all your links in the chat too before the night is over, and then I'll put it in the Facebook post and on my podcast channel, so it's out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So speaking of the word allow, could we maybe talk a little bit about language and anything that comes to mind that you feel like you could share with our audience at this point? I don't want you to give away all of your goods, because I want you to be able to have your business and do what you do. But yeah, anything that you would like to address in that area?
Yeah, so I guess for me, what I want to bring light to is that, one, language is really important. It definitely constructs our reality, but also we don't need to be perfect. And oftentimes as white people, we get caught in perfectionism. And I've definitely seen this in regards to language. And it can freeze us, and we can wind up silencing ourselves. And I just want to bring awareness to that dynamic. And there's a place for, especially white people talking to other white people, for patience and understanding with language. Because we are learning, we are trying to change the way that we're thinking and viewing the world and speaking about the world. So our language can kind of take a little while to catch up to our brains and our hearts and what we're learning. So I just wanted to highlight that. But language is really important, and it can be a huge source of violence as well. And I'm not just talking about slurs, but the ways that we use language, and like the allow, those sorts of things come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that I've been working for many years on decreasing my perfectionism. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just, there's this hypersensitivity to not wanting, especially when the whole thing politically correct and all that came out, not wanting to offend people, not wanting to hurt people, and then doing it anyways and being really like, and at the same time, I think this whole notion of not being perfectionistic is to admit that, you know what, I'm not going to make everybody happy. I am going to make mistakes, and I can apologize for my mistakes as I start to correct them. I mean, if I decide to just keep doing the same thing over and over again, I'm constantly apologizing, then there's really no value to that, right? But if I make a mistake and I learn and I change from that, then I'm adding value to what I just experienced and to what other people have experienced. But the perfectionism piece has silenced me often. Previous years. I mean, I'm talking a lot more than I used to, and I'm learning how to take up space and not to take up space, finding that balance. So yeah, definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, it can definitely get us really caught. Growing up in the Northwest, it was definitely a liberal bubble, but it's also an extremely white area. And so it's like I was in rooms of people who were very comfortable talking about race with other white people who had similar opinions. But when anybody who was different, whether that was a different opinion or folks of other races suddenly showed up, like folks would shut down and not be able to speak, and they'd be caught in that perfectionism stuff and not wanting to make a mistake and not wanting to ruin relationships. And you know, I was definitely in that culture and deeply uncomfortable with it, but I was still in it. I was still not saying anything, even though I knew so much more.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I just finished reading Ijoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, she mentioned in there having a conversation with one of her best friends, how her discomfort was not a priority. Her challenges, what she was facing was not as much a priority to him as his comfort. And I think we do have to get uncomfortable. You know, there are, from what my Black and brown friends have been telling me, they're uncomfortable all the time. For us to sacrifice and be uncomfortable is really not, you know, we need to do it more. You know, there's a lot of discomfort in what's going on. But that was I wish I could remember the exact phrasing, but that part of that book really hit me in a progressive way. You know, like I guess I'm going to do things more often that are uncomfortable. Hopefully that propels more of this movement where we're going in our country around taking a stand and speaking up.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me that I've been coming to terms with is that I am still really uncomfortable. And like, I guess I had some idea that eventually that would not be as strong or somehow it would be easier. I think it just comes more naturally to say something, but I am still deeply uncomfortable. And just like owning that that is part of the work and part of the process. And, you know, you can be doing this for decades and still be really uncomfortable. And that's all right. That's the way it should be.
I mean, that's how change happens.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the attendees, when had the discussion around language, put in the chat, I have a white male professor who is my friend who asked me this question. I want to pause as a white man and step in your shoes for 5 minutes. Tell me what I will experience as a Black woman. And then she continued in the chat, said, this is what he experienced as a Black female. Walked into a bank for a loan. He's redlined. He wants to buy a home in the suburbs. He's told that the house he wants is sold. He's told daily by his white friends, I don't see color when I look at you. He has just been invalidated because if you can't see color, you're saying the person of color is invisible to you. Thank you for sharing. That's really powerful. I particularly that white friend saying, I don't see color, and then that piece of he has just been invalidated because if you can't see color, you're saying to the person of color that they're invisible to you. It's really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That was definitely one of the very toxic beliefs that we perpetuated as white folks after civil rights movement, was suddenly like we just didn't see it, and that was our solution to racial justice, to civil rights, was I just won't see it.
You know, it's interesting because while I know that statement is not that is not part of the solution, the intention behind it, like how does it get rephrased? Because I've heard people say that, and when somebody actually addresses it with them, they're like, no, I see that you are a person of color. What they're trying to say is color doesn't change how I feel about my love. What can you say to that response from someone? That they didn't use the phrase to create invisibility, but as a sign of solidarity. That's what the excuse was that I heard from these people. And I'd be happy to hear from the attendees too, what they feel.
Yeah, I think that specificity is always helpful when we're talking about people we love and cherish, so that they can actually feel loved and cherished. And so that
when they just say a blanket statement of I don't see color, then we're clearly not getting the full.
Yeah, there's no like relationship there. If that's your a way of describing your relationship to a person of color in your life who you care deeply about, then none of that feeling has been conveyed.
Yeah.
So
we also,
go ahead.
well, we also don't say to our white friends, I don't see color.
Right.
Right.
You know, so so why are we saying it to someone of a different race? Like, you know, we don't go up to, you know, like, so it becomes so specified, and that's where that invalidation comes in.
Exactly.
And that's how our language can play a big role in things.
Yeah,
So
and I think that language thing is really important in that, like, I don't feel like in any real context it's helpful to say I don't see that, but like, why don't we actually see you? And like, I see who you are and what you struggle with, and that being a way that I show that I am in solidarity with you is by claiming that in the ways in which I actually see you. Because, you know, solidarity doesn't come from trying to make all of our experiences the same. Right? I can have empathy, I can connect to certain parts, but our experiences are not the same, and we don't need to erase that in order to be comrades in this.
Right.
Yeah, I think that goes back to your earlier point, Heather, regarding connection, right? That being connected and knowing what's happening because we are connected. And,
yeah.
You know,
There have been some pretty incredible videos out lately. I don't know who's seen them, but where they're actually reversing the conversation. If a Black person said this to a white person, there have been a lot of those. And, you know, I think it's about really questioning ourselves, asking ourselves, would I say this to another white person? You know, I mean, like just before we came on the call, you know, I will share this honestly and openly with everybody. I was about to tell Heather I really liked her hair. And then I questioned, wait a minute, is that something I would say to everybody? Because I've been told there are Black women who don't like to, and even in this book by Ajoma Aluo, the commenting on the hair or the hairstyle or wanting to touch hair. I mean, would I say this to someone else? And the fact of the matter is I compliment everybody when I see something to compliment. But there are things culturally that don't work that I am ignorant of in a lot of places. And I'm learning. I mean, I'm authentic and I'm genuine and I say things and I'm, you know, good at adding that specificity that you were talking about and the connection. But I still feel like I need to ask sometimes if it's okay, or I need to pause. And I think pause is good. I think pause is really important. But, you know, it was funny because I immediately asked Heather, I was like, wait, is it okay if I tell you I really like your hair? You know, and that's okay too.
I consented to that compliment.
Yeah, you know, so I think it's really important that, I think the key here for me anyways is pause, you know, and ask myself when I'm talking to a person of color, is the question I'm asking, is the thing I'm saying something that I would also say to a white person? And if it's not, why, where is it coming from? Am I trying to placate? Am I trying to be a better ally? Am I trying to foster a connection or relationship that's not there otherwise? So it's like the intention. What is my intention in my questions and in my curiosity? At least that's what I'm thinking. But I want to be corrected, Heather. You've had more experience in all of this than I have, so maybe I'm even saying and doing something that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that pausing is so important, and there are a lot of ways in which, as white folks, like we just go straight into action. We just like steamroll ahead, and we saw a lot of that after George Floyd. Like suddenly there were all of these call-ins, suddenly all of this attention, and white people just like kind of freaking out, right? Like we really kind of freaked out and wanting to do everything and anything immediately and not thinking it through at all. And so really taking that moment to pause and remind, you know, get back in our bodies and to recenter and then move forward, right? Like it's not saying don't act. Obviously we need white people acting right now, but we don't need white people like flailing about. So having a little bit more considered responses. I also talk about pause a lot just in the ways we think about our sense of fear and safety, and like how do we respond to certain events on the street, like when do we feel fear and when do we not? And you know, like thinking about Rayshard Brooks, who fell asleep drunk in his car, like does that trigger fear for, if that was a, you know, a white person in our community, like we're coming home through the neighborhood, we see a car guy drunk in the car, does that trigger fear and we need to like go and do something to solve this problem? Or do we just be like, all right, person's drunk, I'm just gonna keep going on home and they'll sleep it off eventually. So just being mindful of when those fear responses appear, because a lot of the time for white folks, it's exaggerated. It's not really relating to what's happening in front of us.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I'm trying not to get, I'm emotional right now. I have a greater fear of white men out on the street. And if I'm walking somewhere, I actually, because of my history, because of things I've experienced, I actually have what I've heard women have reactions to black men. I have that reaction to white men. And so it surprises me. I mean, I know it's there, but it surprises me when, you know, white women, and I hadn't even heard, I watched an interview with, it was Stuart Knight. He had his friends, and I wish I could remember the name of the man that spoke, Ian. I don't remember his last name, but Ian said, as a black man, if he sees a single white woman, you know, woman by herself, he crosses the street because he doesn't want any problems. And that made me so sad. I grew up in Berkeley and Oakland. Like this, I was not afraid of black men. I was afraid of white men. So anyways, it just surprises me.
Yeah, get that. I mean, I've heard that from other folks. No, it's fine. Don't need to apologize for emotions.
I don't want to make it about me. That really impacts me every time I hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the ways that our fears show up with strangers in public settings can be really uncontrollable sometimes when we have histories of trauma. And taking a moment to put that into context is always really helpful, so that we can come back to what's actually happening, whatever that is. And, you know, one of my workshops, I heard somebody share that them as a black woman also would cross the street if they saw a white woman to, you know, avoid any potential assumption that she might be dangerous. And, you know, there's this way that as white women, we can often feel like we're the most at risk in scenarios, right? Because of that, the way in which rape is defined, right, by this dynamic. But that often we can be quite threatening. Just our physical bodies can be very threatening in spaces. And I think that's a really hard thing to come to terms with, is that our presence can symbolize so much violence. And we're not used to thinking of it. We're used to thinking of ourselves as the victims to violence rather than representatives of that.
I mean, history has so many examples of a white woman being raped and it being blamed on a black man, and then the entire black community is being, you know, assassinated, basically. I mean, it's just awful.
Yeah.
You know, and watching the current administration, it's like they're just out to get black people. That's how it feels.
Yeah, we are definitely in a white supremacist administration and have been. Yeah. It's gotten pretty extreme these days.
Yeah. So there were some comments. One said, let's face it, often there is no malice or bad intent, still not an excuse. Sadly, sometimes people say the worst things trying to connect. And someone else said, I feel they didn't think about how it would be interpreted, the whole I don't see color statement. Most often people use comfortable cliches. I am guilty of this, as we all are, this person said. And yeah, the chat is open for everyone.
I mean,
so I just want to clarify for somebody. Yeah, you guys can chat either to just the panelists or to panelists and attendees. So to clarify that. And then if people are watching on Facebook, you can certainly ask questions and put them in the chat as well. We're going back and forth to check what's happening there. So thank you, everybody. So what you were going to say something else, Heather? Sorry, I broke in.
Just that I think that it's important to always hold impact and intention simultaneously, right? Like the intention doesn't excuse the impact. And often for white folks, we have a big disconnect between what our intention is and what our actual impact is. So, you know, I think that there's space for compassion around good intentions, but that doesn't erase, you know, accountability and critique and holding ourselves to a much higher standard and really working to shrink that gap between our intentions and our actions.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it's not easy work by any means. It's deeply imperfect.
Yeah, we are deeply imperfect. The system is deeply imperfect. Yeah. Yeah. And there's, you know, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do. And and you know, we talk about doing, but there's also a lot to be, you know, focusing on that connection piece. As an empath, if I say something, I generally see that it's affected somebody, whether it's positive or negative or indifferent, but I can see in their body, in their facial expression, I feel the energy. And I typically will say something like, did I just say something that upset you? You know, and I'm grateful. I mean, it's been a life history of being told I'm too sensitive to this, to that. But today I'm grateful because I can sense it and I can correct it, hopefully quickly. But there are a lot of people that don't even have a clue when they've said something, how it affects other people. And I wish I had a solution for that, except for people to pause, you know, and to educate themselves. You know, everybody who attends the webinars, I send out an after email with all the links that have been accumulated for readings, for podcasts, for interviews, for donation opportunities, for service opportunities, because we just can't stop educating ourselves, you know?
Yeah, it's a continual journey.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I kind of want to go to one of the questions that you got beforehand.
Yeah, the email questions. Yeah,
because there was,
you took notes.
yeah, I did take notes. Well, partly because this is a question that's asked a lot. Is like, essentially, what do I do? Right. That's what I heard. There was a question about policy and like moving towards anti-racism, and there is that question that comes from white people a lot. And the thing that I want to just reframe is this assumed powerlessness. It often comes from a place like we don't have power to change white supremacy or white supremacist systems. But we are the most able to change those systems, right? We are the closest to power as white women or as white people in general. Like we are close to power and we have that ease with authority. I mean, obviously people have their own issues sometimes with authority. I know I've had my issues with authority, but we have that closer proximity and comfort with authority. So reframing that and really looking at where you have power in your life. And you know, that means like, you know, inventorying what communities you're a part of and where are your spheres of influence, who are you navigating with, and how can you show up differently in those spaces and use your privilege for something that's beneficial for others, whatever that scenario is. Yeah, so there's not one way to address policy. There's not one way to change those things, but the biggest way is by really seeing how powerful we are and that we can actually use that to dismantle this system.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there's a comment in the chat, which I love because I think this does help change the system. You know, it's you know, Cesar Chavez says you talk to one person who talks to one person who talks to one person, right? This person wrote down personal experience before COVID. I entered a crowded elevator. I was in the very front. No one said a word, and I'm an extrovert. I turned around as the elevator was rising and said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all become friends when this elevator door opens? For 2 seconds, it was silence, and then smiles and laughter. I met 3 new friends when the elevator doors opened. I mean, that is just so cool. I love it. And I do similar things like that. I'll talk to people in grocery lines and I'll talk to people in elevators, you know, but I think our culture is a silent culture. even the Europeans tease us because they call us Puritans because of the body. You know, that there's so much there's so much sheltering that goes on in this country, and denying and avoiding. I probably just jumped from that topic, but anyways, my head is all over the place tonight. I don't know what's going on.
Right, whiteness is all over the place, so you know.
yeah, exactly. Quick, catch it, quick.
Yeah, right.
Get a cootie
like that.
catcher.
It's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's definitely a big piece of white American culture, is that kind of isolation and shutting down, and yeah, that Puritanism is definitely deep, and you know, that's sort of where the nuclear family came from, and you know, just put up your walls and doors, and that's what leads you to safety, right? So it kind of makes sense that we would create this insane prison industrial system, right? Because our sense of safety is confined spaces, right? Whether it's a mansion with a gate or a prison cell, like that's what keeps us safe, is these little boxes. And not all cultures have that idea. They don't have that conception, and some of breaking that is really building relationships with people around us, and sort of shifting that idea of safety from individual to communal. And that the shift, you know, I heard this actually in regards to anti-racism with kids and upbringing, right? Like if you think about, like, I want what's best for my kid, right? That's a very instinctual thing, and that tends to lead a lot of white parents towards, you know, private schools and that sort of like white-centered education, because they're like, I want the best possible education for my kid. But instead shifting to like, I want the best education for all kids, and then that can actually shift how you're approaching your kids' education, and how you're showing up at, you know, if it's your local public school, advocating for those kids and advocating for policy changes, and seeing that as like, you know, your kids' success is not about them individually having this amazing academic experience, but it's them within the context of a community. And how can we as white people really shift our understanding of that?
Yeah.
I think is a really powerful place, and a place that I feel that we're going to culturally right now, as I hear more conversations about it.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Yeah,
it's interesting, just to go back a little bit towards the conversation of being silent. So I finished one book, I'm reading 2 other books, but one book I'm reading right now is When They Call You a Terrorist, by Patrice Kahn-Cullors and Asha Bandelli. I wish I knew how to say it. I'll look it up. But you know, in white culture, it seems that we are silent to hide wrongdoings. And what she's talking about in her book is there's silence to hide having been wronged. Because there's a lot of things, the police have beaten up her brothers, nobody talks about it. She just met her her father, that was her real father, nobody talks about it. When she comes back from visiting, like there's this this other level of silence, but I don't think it's covering wrongdoings like I feel in white culture. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to hear some perspective on that.
I don't really have anything to add on that more than what I've said, but I mean, I know that is definitely how we as white people operate, is definitely silence around hiding.
Yeah, I wouldn't be, I mean, this is one book and one author. So from her experiences, it was like, there are certain things you just don't talk about, just like what I've seen in white culture, but not just like. So yeah, you know, I think all cultures have different ways of dealing with speaking up and silencing themselves or silencing others. And so the culture that we're focusing on right now is this one, you know. But yeah, I don't know if there are any other, oh, somebody's having to leave. Okay, thank you so much. So glad you were here. Yeah, I'd love for you to continue attending and passing on the word. I remember getting your email, so thank you so much. It's good to know you were here. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else, Jody. Did you have a question, or Heather, that's something that you wanted to bring up?
I don't have anything specific on my mind right now.
I'm wondering if one thing that I'm still learning to understand are microaggressions. And maybe, I don't know, I know that's not necessarily your topic, but are there specific microaggressions that you're aware of that we could inform our listeners not to use?
I mean, there's a lot because they're small and they're every day, right? It can be actually, I find, you know, as a white person, like this is also part of the ways in which whiteness thrives, is that they feel subtle and every day, so I don't notice them as much, right? So even if I'm doing it, I'm not necessarily going to remember it in the same way. So it's tricky in that regard. So, I mean, obviously there's the big ones about hair and about saying people's names and that sort of subtlety of power and control that we use, like allow, like those sorts of terms. But there's so many different ways that it shows up in our daily lives. I mean, I'll tell a personal story. One, when I was in fashion school, I was in the studio, and one of my closest friends at the time was a Latino man, and we were working together, and he was talking about his experience of racism at a particular fabric store that we frequented a lot, and being followed and being suspect. And without thinking about it, I went and I centered my experience. I highlighted my experience at the other fabric store, because there's only two in the area, the other fabric store where I felt objectified as a woman, and I felt followed, and I felt uncomfortable in my body. And it wasn't even, I didn't even have the moment of pause to consider that we could both have those experiences in one space, but I spoke over him and I really centered my own experience in that moment. And it wasn't until like later that night that I realized what I had done. I was like, oh, I've got to write that. I've got to say something to him. And, you know, I think he even kind of dismissed it, because the ways that white people commit microaggressions is every day. And a lot of people of color get really used to it, so they also minimize it. So he was actually kind of surprised that I came back and I said something about this experience, and was like, that was really not okay of me to do. I want to honor your experience in this fabric store. Like, that is real. So, you know, there's all those little things in how we show up every day, and just because they're small and subtle and we may not notice it doesn't mean they're not violence and have a lasting impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in a Q&A with my coaching program, and we raise our hand virtually, you know, on the Zoom, and there were 3 or 4 hands up, and I put mine up, and the coach called on somebody, and then they called on me. And I unmuted myself and I said, actually, this person was first, because this person was first, not just because she was Black, but she was first. And the coach actually said, I'll take care of it. I'll get to everybody. And what I felt like I had a hard time actually phrasing my question at that point, because I was surprised. And I ended up getting a message later from the other woman saying, that was really kind of you, that you noticed. Thank you. And I wasn't expecting a thank you, but it's true that she and I both saw that her hand was up first. But this is with you know, with regards to, you know, I walk into the U-Haul office in Sacramento, and this other couple were there, a Black couple, and the woman behind the desk called on me. And I said, they were first in line. And the other woman said, yeah, we were first in line. And I mean, that's just human decency, but it was very clear to me that there was this racism element. And I didn't understand, how can you bypass somebody who's standing in line first? So I don't know, that's just a little example. I get confused by how people really don't notice certain things, or they notice and they purposefully shift and make other people wait. I actually have multiple examples that I won't go into, but I think it's even that is, it's micro to some, but it's macro to others.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, who's to define what's micro and macro?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely what I say, is that the difference between like overt and covert violence, or microaggressions and overt violence, is like really meaningless when it comes to people of color's lived experience, right? Like, that distinction is more for us, so we can kind of navigate what that difference is, and I guess like understand it differently than like, okay, I didn't say a racial slur, so like I guess good on me for that. But like I have all these other things in me.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think what it comes down to is paying attention, pausing, educating ourselves, reaching out. And there are a lot of sources. One of the things that Ijema Olua says in her book is, please don't use us Black people as Google. Please use Google. You don't have to call a Black friend to get, just like, I have somebody who would ask me, is such in the fridge? I'm like, you could open the fridge and go look and see if it's there. It's like, let's not use people when we can find out for ourselves, getting resources. And yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much. When we have multiple panelists, I usually go for 90 minutes. I think that we've covered quite a bit tonight. And for the sake of the recording, though, Heather, I would really love for you to give your website address. If you want to describe an upcoming workshop that you have, I would love for you to highlight that. And anything else you'd like to offer the listeners and viewers.
Yeah, let me just get these websites in so that they are there for you. And there's no...
Yeah, I'll definitely post them in all the other areas.
And that's the specific event. So, yeah, I've been doing a lot of like short 1-day, couple hour sessions over the summer. And for the most part, I do those sliding scale and with required donations to people of color run organizations. And right now I have just launched a new 5-week long workshop. So I'm excited for this. It's definitely a deep dive into what is white womanhood. So we kind of break that down, and I go deep into, I use a lot of the material for one day that you guys were there for. So really talking about the violence of white women's safety, but I'm also going to dive really deep into white saviorism and speak to how the default of innocence and victimhood keeps us from accountability, and then moving into like, how do we conceive of ourselves as acting agents? Like, what are we doing in the world, and how are we moving through this? And again, really trying to have that balance of facts while also being rooted in like vulnerable storytelling and being honest about our lives and our histories as we understand this stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. I think it will be immensely challenging for me and for you, whoever shows up. And so the pay structure I've done is that there's a fee for the class, which helps to support me and the organization. And then there's a required accountability donation that you make directly to this organization. So I've chose Insight for this one, and Insight has particularly been around for a couple of decades, working at the intersection of sexual violence and racism and the prison industrial complex. So that's the organization that I'm highlighting for this workshop. Yeah. And eventually there'll be another sliding scale one, like 1-day thing, but right now I'm focused on the 5 weeks. So if you follow the website, you can hop on my mailing list and hear about any other updates I have there. Yeah, this is not easy stuff, and it's lifelong stuff. So that's what I'll say with that. But I'm really glad to have this conversation with you all. I feel like it's been really interesting and productive. We've talked about a lot of material.
We did. We covered a lot, and I don't know. I won't apologize, but yeah, I'm all over the place right now. My heart is, after watching 4 days of the convention and been doing a lot of volunteering for that change, like I'm all over the place. My heart, my head, and I've got to find a way to kind of bring it in. Because, but yeah, we covered a lot, and I think everything we discussed was important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do agree that we're lifelong. If we are willing to be lifelong learners, change is going to happen. Change.
Absolutely. It's really just, continuing to deepen that commitment and see how important it is for our health and well-being to maintain this practice.
And continue to talk about it.
Right.
Yeah, right. The practice of doing it.
Too much silence for whites.
Yeah.
Silence, and people are finally starting to actually witness, observe it, and speak out, which is important.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you to all the attendees. And there were comments saying panelists were awesome and very authentic. Thank you so much. And I'm wishing you luck, to the person who wrote that, in your city political career. Hoping that, I would love for you to reach out to me. I'm happy to support you and help you if there's fundraising you need done. I would love to support people of color. And yeah, we've got to change. We've got to change. We just have to do it. So thank you everyone for showing up. I'm going to stop the live stream on the Facebook, and then I'm going to pause or stop the recording. Thank you everybody. We're saying goodbye to everybody.
Bye.